The ground shook, not from an earthquake, but from 40,000 lbs of rage thundering across the Arizona desert. The mammoth matriarch's eyes blazed with ancient fury as she charged, tusks gleaming like ivory spears in the morning sun. Behind her, 4 more giants followed, a living avalanche of flesh and bone. The hunters held their ground, 13 men armed with nothing but sharpened stones and the audacity to believe they could kill a god. This was Murray Springs, 13,000 years ago. In the next 10 minutes, one species would take a step toward dominance. The other would take a step toward extinction. And the man at the center of it all, a Clovis hunter whose name time forgot, was about to discover that killing a mammoth was the easy part. Living with what came next would haunt his people for the next 500 generations. The morning mist clung to the San Pedro River Valley like a burial shroud. Dakota pressed his palm against the earth, feeling the vibrations through his fingertips. 5 mammoths, maybe 6, moving toward the spring where they drank for countless generations. He'd been tracking this family group for 7 days, following them from the Hookah Mountains across the grasslands that would one day become Arizona. His band of 13 hunters had eaten nothing but dried meat and cactus fruit, saving their strength for this moment. "They know we're here," whispered Nakai, his younger brother, gripping a spear tipped with the finest Clovis point their grandfather had ever knapped. The fluted stone gleamed like black glass, its edges sharp enough to shave with. Dakota nodded. Of course, they knew. Mammoths forgot nothing. Their matriarch had probably smelled them 2 days ago, cataloging their scent in a memory that stretched back 60 winters, but she came to the spring anyway. The drought had been long, and even giants had to drink. The archaeological evidence would later show this moment frozen in time. Mammoth trackways preserved beneath algal deposits, human footprints intersecting at precise angles. But Dakota didn't know he was making history. He only knew his people were starving, and 40,000 lbs of meat stood between them and survival. He studied the wind, watched the way the grass bent, calculated angles and distances with a precision that would make modern engineers weep with envy. His hand found the atlatl at his side, the spear thrower that would multiply his arm strength threefold. The plan was simple, it had to be. Complex plans died with the men who made them. "Remember," he breathed to his hunters, "the matriarch first. Always the matriarch first." They'd learned this from watching dire wolves hunt, kill the leader, and the family group would mill in confusion just long enough for 13 men to do the impossible. The sun broke over the Dragoon Mountains, painting the valley in shades of blood and gold. Somewhere a raven called, the desert's eternal witness to death. Dakota rose from his crouch, muscles coiled like a rattlesnake before the strike. 40,000 lbs of mammoth, 13 men with stone-tipped spears. The odds were insane. The alternative was starvation. He raised his atlatl, the Clovis point catching the light like a star fallen to earth. Behind him, 12 brothers did the same. The last great hunt was about to begin. 3 moons earlier, in a cave overlooking the Salt River, Old held the stone up to the firelight. His hands, gnarled by 40 winters of napping, trembled, not from age, but from awe. "This will be my last point," he told his grandson Dakota. "My greatest." The obsidian had come from the sacred mountain, 5 days' walk to the north. Black as midnight, pure as water, it held the power to become anything the napper willed. But willpower wasn't enough. It took knowledge passed down through generations, each failure teaching what the stone would and wouldn't allow. A hot hammerstone, a river cobble worn smooth by 1,000 points, struck the obsidian core with surgical precision. The crack rang through the cave like a bell. A flake fell away, perfect as a butterfly's wing. "The mammoth's hide is 4 fingers thick," Aot explained as he worked. "The point must be long enough to reach the heart, strong enough to pierce bone, sharp enough to slice blood vessels." His hands moved in a rhythm older than memory. Strike, pressure, flake, each blow calculated, each angle considered. The secret was the flute. Other peoples made sharp stones, but Clovis hunters had discovered something revolutionary. By removing a channel flake from the base, a technique so difficult that 2 in 10 points shattered attempting it, they created a groove that would lock the point to its shaft like a key in a lock. No amount of impact would separate stone from spear. "Watch!" Aod commanded. This was the moment that separated Clovis craftsmen from all who came before. He switched to an antler tine, its tip worn to a perfect point by countless uses. Placing it precisely at the base, he increased pressure gradually. The stone resisted, holding its form with stubborn integrity. More pressure. The antler bent. Aod's breathing stopped, then a sound like ice cracking on a winter pond. The channel flake released, running up the point's center like a river of absence. Perfect, symmetrical, impossible. Dakota had watched his grandfather make dozens of points. This one was different. This one sang with deadly purpose. "The stone knows what it must become," Aod said, turning the point in the firelight. 6 inches long, perfectly balanced, edges sharp enough to cut shadows. "We only help it remember." He hafted it to a shaft of willow, selected for its straightness and dried for a full season. Pine pitch, melted with fat and mixed with charcoal, bound the point to wood. Sinew, taken from the leg of an elk and pounded until it separated into fibers thinner than hair, wrapped the junction with a strength that would outlast the men who tied it. The finished spear was more than a weapon. It was an accumulated genius, the knowledge of 100 generations focused into a single point of stone. "The mammoth's ribs angle back," Aod continued, using a charred stick to draw on the cave wall. "Strike here," he marked a spot behind the front leg, "and the point slides between bones into the heart. Strike here," another mark, "and you hit bone, shatter the point, die under its feet." Dakota memorized every word, every gesture. Survival wasn't about courage. It was about knowledge passed from grandfather to grandson in caves lit by dying fires. "One day," Aod said, pressing the spear into Dakota's hands, "you'll need this. When that day comes, remember we don't hunt mammoths because we're strong. We hunt them because we're smart." 3 moons later, standing in the morning mist at Murray Springs, Dakota gripped that same spear and whispered a prayer to his grandfather's spirit. The old man had been right about everything, especially about the fear. The mammoth matriarch stood like a mountain against the sky. 60 winters had carved wisdom into her ancient face, and her tusks, each longer than a man could reach, bore the scars of 1,000 battles. She'd survived saber-tooth attacks, droughts that killed half her herd, and the slow disappearance of the world she'd been born into. But she'd never faced Clovis hunters before. Dakota gave the signal, a raven's call, perfect in its mimicry. 12 men moved like shadows through the saltbush and mesquite. They'd rehearsed this dance with deer, practiced on bison, but mammoths were different. Mammoths remembered. The matriarch's trunk rose, testing the air. Her massive head turned, fixing Dakota with an eye that held too much intelligence for an animal. In that gaze, he saw recognition, not of him personally, but of what he represented, death walking on 2 legs. She trumpeted, a sound that liquefied courage and sent ice through veins. The other mammoths clustered behind her, a defensive wall of flesh and tusk. 2 juveniles, barely weaned, pressed against their mother's legs. Another female, heavy with a calf, stood to the matriarch's left. Perfect, exactly where the hunters needed them. Nakai moved first, sprinting from cover with his atlatl already in motion. The spear flew like a dark thought, its Clovis point catching sunlight for a heartbeat before disappearing into the matriarch's side. The sound it made, wet, meaty, final, would echo in their dreams forever. She screamed, not trumpeted, screamed, a sound that belonged to no animal that walked the earth. Her trunk lashed out, catching Kuruk before he could dodge. The hunter flew 20 feet, his ribs crushed like dry twigs. He was dead before he hit the ground. But the plan was already in motion. 11 more spears flew from 11 different angles. Most missed. It's hard to aim when your target is charging. But 3 found their marks. 1 in her shoulder, 1 in her belly, 1 impossibly in her throat. The matriarch stumbled. Blood, impossibly red against the desert sand, poured from her wounds. But she didn't fall. Mammoths never made dying easy. She charged Dakota, and time stretched like sinew. He saw everything, the fury in her eyes, the blood frothing from her trunk, the ground shaking under her weight. His grandfather's words echoed, "Strike here, and the point slides between bones." He didn't throw his spear. He planted it, driving the butt into the earth at a perfect angle. He dove aside as physics took over. 40,000 lbs of mammoth met 6 inches of obsidian, and the stone won. The point disappeared into her chest, the shaft splintering under impact that would have driven it through armor. She made it 3 more steps, 3 steps that covered 15 feet and lasted forever. Then her front legs buckled, and the mountain fell. The earth shook, dust rose like smoke. The other mammoths milled in confusion, trumpeting their distress. Without their matriarch, they were lost. The hunters closed in, spears ready. What followed was butchery in its purest form, not cruel, necessity never is, but thorough. 4 more mammoths fell in the next 10 minutes. Each death was a victory and a tragedy written in blood on the black mat of algae that would preserve this moment for 13,000 years. When it was over, 5 mammoths lay dead. Kuruk lay with them, his sacrifice part of an ancient equation. 1 human life for 200,000 lbs of meat, the math of survival. Dakota stood over the matriarch, his grandfather's broken spear still jutting from her chest. Her eye, clouding in death, seemed to hold a question. Was it worth it? He wouldn't know the answer for 13,000 years. The butchering began before the blood stopped flowing. 5 mammoths contained enough meat to feed Dakota's band for 2 winters if they could process it before the Arizona sun turned flesh to rot. Women and children materialized from hiding places among the cottonwoods, carrying baskets and stone knives. Even the smallest child knew their role. In the economy of survival, everyone worked, or everyone starved. Ayana, Dakota's wife, took charge with the authority of someone who'd done this before. "Start with the belly," she commanded. "The organs spoil first." The hunters became butchers, their Clovis points transforming from weapons to tools. The same edges that had pierced hide now sliced through it, revealing the impossible abundance within. The liver alone weighed more than a child. The heart, when they finally freed it from its cage of ribs, took 2 men to carry. Every cut followed patterns taught by grandmothers to daughters since time before memory. The hide came off in sections, each piece precious as the meat beneath. Winter was coming, it always was, and mammoth hide could turn a brush shelter into a fortress against cold. Young Nieli worked beside her mother, learning through mimicry. Cut here where the muscle attaches, twist the blade to separate sinew from bone. Save everything. The sinew for thread, the bones for marrow, the tusks for tools not yet imagined. "See how the ancestors guide our hands," Ayana told her daughter, showing where to slice along the natural divisions of muscle. "The mammoth gives us everything, but only if we honor the giving with skill." The sun climbed toward its zenith, and urgency pressed like a physical weight. Already, ravens gathered in the cottonwoods, their black eyes calculating patience. Coyotes would come with darkness, and if the wind shifted wrong, dire wolves might catch the scent from 10 miles away. Dakota organized the men into teams, 4 to dig cache pits in the cool earth near the spring, 6 to strip meat from bone, cutting it into long strips for drying, 2 to keep watch. Death had a way of following abundance in this land. His hands worked automatically, but his mind wandered to Kuruk's body, covered respectfully with stones, until they could afford time for proper burial. The exchange rate of the universe, 1 hunter for 5 mammoths. Kuruk had 3 children. They would eat through winter because of his sacrifice. By midday, the first cache pit was ready. A hole as deep as a man is tall, lined with mammoth hide, hair side out. They packed it with the choicest cuts, tenderloin, tongue, the fatty humps that would render into oil. Cover it with hide, then earth, then stones to discourage diggers. Mark it with a pattern of rocks that looked random to strangers, but screamed property to anyone who knew the signs. "Look," called young Hanovi from his perch on a boulder. He pointed east, where dust rose like smoke signals. "Others come." Dakota's hand found his knife. In this land of scarcity, meat brought conflict as surely as flowers brought bees. But as the figures resolved from heat shimmer to human forms, he relaxed. The Bitter Water Band, led by old Kasumi, allies, or at least not enemies. Kasumi approached with the careful courtesy of someone who understood the delicate politics of a kill site. His people stopped at speaking distance, close enough to talk, far enough to show no threat. "The ravens told us of your success," Kasumi said formally. His eyes took in the 5 mammoth carcasses, calculating. "Your spears flew true. The ancestors guided them," Dakota replied, equally formal. Then, because generosity was the only wealth that mattered, "Will you share our abundance?" The old man's weathered face cracked into a smile. "We bring salt from the dry lakes, good for preserving." And so the circle widened. 2 bands working together could process what one could not. The Bitter Water women knew songs that made the work flow like the river. Their children played with Dakota's band's children, wrestling in the red dust while their parents carved up giants. As the sun touched the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of fire, Dakota allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. 6 cache pits filled, drying racks heavy with strips of meat. Everyone's belly is full for the first time on a moon. Tomorrow, they will mourn Kuruk properly. Tomorrow, they would begin the long process of turning hide to leather, bone to tools, ivory to art. But tonight, they will feast. The last mammoths at Murray Springs had given their final gift. Time. Time to eat. Time to rest. Time to pretend the world wasn't changing. Time to forget that they were the last generation who would ever taste mammoth meat. 3 days after the kill, Dakota returned to Murray Springs alone. The processing was done, the meat cached, Kuruk buried with his broken spear pointing toward the sunset. Now came the hardest part, understanding what they'd done. The kill site looked different in the gentle morning light where proud giants had walked. Only stains remained, dark patches where blood had soaked into earth that would remember this day for 13,000 years. Scattered bones, too heavy to move, already being cleaned by industrious beetles. The skull of the matriarch, massive and somehow accusatory, half buried in the sand. He'd come to retrieve the tusks. Ivory was too valuable to leave, but found himself standing frozen at the spring's edge. The mammoth trails were still visible, worn deep by centuries of use. How many generations had walked these paths? How many matriarchs had led their families to this water, teaching their daughters the way as they'd been taught? Never again. The thought hit like a spear to the gut. Oh, there were other mammoths scattered across the grasslands from here to the great ice, but Dakota had lived long enough to see the truth written in absence. When he was a boy, herds of 50 were common. Now finding 5 together was cause for celebration or execution. He knelt beside the matriarch's skull, running his fingers along the tusk's spiral grooves. Each ridge represented a year of growth, a year of memories locked in ivory. 60 ridges, 60 winters of watching the world empty of her kind. "Did you know?" he asked the empty sockets that had once held wisdom. "Did you know you were among the last?" The skull didn't answer, but the wind through the cottonwood sounded like mourning. A shadow fell across the bones. Dakota's hand went to his knife before recognizing the limping gait. Aot, his grandfather, died these 3 moons, but walking still in the manner of spirits or memory so strong they took form. "You did well," the old man said, though his lips didn't move. The words came from everywhere and nowhere. The points flew true. "Your point," Dakota corrected. "Your last fitting." Its spirit form settled beside him, translucent in the morning sun. "My last point for the last mammoths. The world has a sense of balance." "Is that what this is? Balance?" Dakota gestured at the killing ground. "We've tipped the scales so far, they've broken." "Yes, simple, final. That's what humans do. We break things to understand them. We kill to live. We end stories to begin new ones. But their story was so much longer than ours, and now it's over." The ghost of his grandfather flickered like heat mirages. "The question is, what story will you tell with the time their deaths brought you?" Dakota wanted to rage against the unfairness of it, but who would he rage at? The gods who made humans clever enough to craft Clovis points? The climate that pushed mammoths and humans into competition? His own belly, which demanded meat regardless of consequence? "I don't know if we're worthy of their ending," he admitted. "Worthiness is for the living to decide. The dead only give gifts." Aot's form was fading now, becoming one with the dust devils that danced across the valley. "Speaking of which, look closer at the spring. The mammoths left you one last present." Then he was gone, leaving only questions and the taste of dust. Dakota approached the spring cautiously. The mammoths had churned the earth in their death throes, but near the water's edge, their feet had exposed something. Stone, but not natural stone. He brushed away the sand, and his breath caught. Clovis points, dozens of them, napped from the same distinctive red chert. Old, older than his grandfather's grandfather. Someone else had hunted here, had cached their weapons for a future that never came. Each point was perfect, a master's work, but beneath them, deeper still, he found something that made his hands shake. Bones, not mammoth, human, and among the bones, beads of shell that could only have come from the distant ocean. Understanding struck like lightning. This wasn't the first last hunt. Other humans had stood where he stood, had killed the mammoths of their time, had cached weapons for hunts that would never come. The story was older than he'd imagined, a cycle of endings that stretched back to the first clever ape who'd learned to sharpen stone. He gathered the ancient points carefully. They would hunt again, these ghost weapons. The mammoths were ending, but humans would need to eat tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. As he worked, a raven landed on the matriarch's tusk. It studied him with eyes older than civilization, cawing once as if to say, "We've seen this before, we'll see it again." Dakota shouldered his burden of ivory and stone, leaving the killing ground to its ghosts. Behind him, the spring gurgled on, indifferent to the giants who would never drink from it again. The last mammoth hunt at Murray Springs was over. But somewhere to the north, other hunters were waking. Other points were being napped. Other giants were walking toward their destiny. The story wasn't over. It was accelerating toward an end that would echo for 13,000 years. The runner arrived at sunset, feet bleeding from his 3-day sprint across the Llano Estacado. Dakota had never seen a man run himself so close to death. The message he carried was worth it. "Blackwater Draw," he gasped, collapsing by their fire. 30 mammoths, maybe more. The biggest gathering in living memory. Silence fell like a stone into still water. 30 mammoths. It was impossible. It was a gift from the gods. It was the end of the world. Okasumi spoke first, his voice heavy with the weight of seeing too much. "If 30 have gathered, it's because there are no others. They come together when the world empties." Dakota felt the truth of it in his bones. Murray Springs had been 5. Before that, his father spoke of hunting groups of 8, maybe 10, but 30? That was the talk of grandmothers of the time before. "Where?" Ayana asked, already calculating. 30 mammoths meant meat for a dozen bands, but also competition. Blood would flow, and not all of it would be mammoth. 3 days north, the runner managed, where the water never fails. But others know. The Folsom people are coming from the east, the desert walkers from the south. Everyone knows. Dakota stood, decision crystallizing. Then we go, and we go now. The camp exploded into motion. This wasn't just a hunt. It was a pilgrimage. Every band with Clovis points and courage would converge on Blackwater Draw, the last great gathering for the last great herd. They traveled by moonlight, 60 souls moving like ghosts across the desert. Dakota carried his grandfather's points, the ancient ones from Murray Springs, and 3 new ones Ayana had napped from volcanic glass that caught the moon like frozen fire. On the second night they met others, the Sunrise Band, led by a woman named Ka, whose reputation with an atlatl was legendary. Her people merged with theirs without discussion. When hunting the last mammoths on Earth, old rivalries seemed petty. "My grandmother saw 50 once," Ka said as they shared dried meat. "She said they moved like mountains walking. The earth shook for days." "My son will never see one," Dakota replied. It wasn't a question. "But he'll know the word mammoth. We'll make sure of that." They reached Blackwater Draw as dawn painted the sky purple. The scene that greeted them defied comprehension. Mammoths, not 30, closer to 40, bulls, cows, calves, a gathering that belonged to another age. They stood in the ancient lakebed, clustered around the spring that had drawn their kind for 10,000 years. And surrounding them, on every ridge and rise, human hunters waited. Dakota counted 5 bands, maybe 6, 100 hunters, maybe more, all armed with Clovis points that glinted like stars fallen to earth, all waiting for someone to make the first move. "This isn't a hunt," Nakai whispered. "This is a funeral." The mammoths knew. How could they not? They stood in a defensive circle, calves in the center, tusks facing out. But their eyes held no defiance, only exhaustion. They'd walked from the ends of the earth to drink from this last reliable water, and they'd found death waiting. A bull mammoth, ancient beyond measure, separated from the herd. His tusks swept the ground as he walked, 100 winters of growth, a century of memory. He trumpeted once, a sound that carried grief like wind carries dust. Then he knelt, simply folded his great legs and knelt in the mud, offering his neck to the spears. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, nobody moved. Mammoth and human locked in a tableau that would never come again. The last act of the greatest drama ever played on North American soil. Then someone threw. The spell broke. 100 spears flew like a flock of deadly birds, and Blackwater Draw became a killing ground that would stain the earth for 13,000 years. The woman emerged from the blizzard like a spirit made of ice and determination. Dakota's band had sheltered in a canyon near the Colby site, waiting for the storm to break. They weren't expecting visitors, especially not one carrying a baby on her back and dragging a travois loaded with frozen meat. "I am Kimmy," she said, ice crackling from her fur hood. "Last of the bone stackers, I have something to trade." Dakota studied her in the firelight. Young, maybe 20 winters, but her eyes held the weight of someone who'd seen their world end. The baby on her back was silent, too silent, alive, but barely. "Come to the fire," Ayana said, mother's instinct overriding caution. "Your child needs warmth." As Kimmy tended to her infant, she told her story. Her band had been at Colby when the last mammoths came through, 7 giants struggling through early winter snow. Her people had killed them all in a single day, a feat that should have meant survival through the cold moons. "But we were too few to process so much," she said, holding her baby close. 18 of us. We tried to cache the meat, stacking the bones as our fathers taught. One pile, then another, protected from scavengers, frozen for keeping. Her voice broke. The sickness came with the first blizzard. The old ones said it was a mammoth curse. The young ones just died one by one. By the new moon, only I remained. Dakota exchanged glances with Nakai. They'd heard of the bone stacking at Colby, a technique for preserving massive amounts of meat. Layer bones and meat in excavated pits, cover with hides, let winter do the rest. Their own caches at Murray Springs were modeled on such wisdom. "You left the caches?" Kasumi asked, incredulous. Abandoning that much meat was like burning wealth. "I took what I could carry. The rest waits." Kimmy pulled something from her pack. A Clovis point, unlike any Dakota had seen. The fluting ran nearly to the tip, and the stone itself was a deep red jasper that seemed to hold fire. "This was my father's," she said. "It never missed. I'll trade it and the location of our caches for a place in your band." "The meat could be cursed," someone muttered. Others nodded. Mammoth curses were real as winter. Everyone knew that. But Dakota was thinking like a leader, not a superstitious child. 7 mammoths already cached, enough meat to see them through to spring, maybe beyond. The arithmetic of survival didn't care about curses. "We'll go at first light," he decided. "If the meat is good, you have a place with us." The storm broke before dawn, revealing a world scoured clean and sparkling. They found the Colby caches exactly where Kimmy described, 2 massive stacks of bones arranged with architectural precision. The top layers had been disturbed by scavengers, but below, protected by the bone ceiling and preserved by cold, lay treasure, frozen mammoth steaks marbled with fat, tongues the size of a child, leg bones cracked for marrow, but still rich with sustenance. It was a fortune in protein, abandoned to the elements. "Why stack them like this?" young Honovi asked, marveling at the engineering. The bones weren't random, they interlocked, creating stable structures that had survived winds that could knock down a man. "Weight distribution," Dakota explained, seeing it now. "The bones protect the meat, but also press it down, squeezing out air, preventing rot. And see," he pointed to the arrangement, "water drains away, can't pool and freeze the cache solid." They worked through the day, transferring meat to their own travois. Kimmy worked hardest of all, as if trying to earn her place through exhaustion. Her baby, warmed and fed, began to cry, a healthy sound that made everyone smile. As the sun set, painting the snow-covered plains in shades of rose and gold, Dakota stood atop the bone pile and looked west. Somewhere out there, the last mammoth herds were gathering, driven together by the emptying of the world. How many more caches like this existed? How many bands had killed their last mammoth and then died themselves, leaving their triumph to feed strangers? "We're scavengers now," Nakai said, reading his thoughts. "Living off the dead." "We're survivors," Dakota corrected, "and we honor the dead by living." That night, they held a feast from the bone stacker's cache. Kimmy taught them a song her people had sung while stacking, a rhythm that made the work flow like water. Her voice was clear and strong, and soon others joined, their harmonies weaving through the cold air like warmth itself. The baby cooed and reached for the fire, eyes bright with life stolen back from winter. In that moment, Dakota understood something profound. They weren't just hunting mammoths anymore, they were inheriting them. Their meat, their bones, their stories. The age of hunting was ending. The age of memory had begun. The old Napa arrived at their camp like a storm, sudden, powerful, and impossible to ignore. Tala, she called herself, though Dakota suspected that wasn't her birth name. Her hands were a map of scars, each one a lesson learned in stone. "I heard you took the Colby cache," she said without preamble. "Good. Waste is the only sin the earth won't forgive. I have something better to trade than meat." She unwrapped a leather bundle with the reverence of a priest, revealing relics. Inside lay 12 Clovis points, but these were different. The fluting was deeper, the edges somehow sharper, and the balance, even just looking at them, Dakota could feel their perfect weight. "Last month, I watched the dent hunters take 8 mammoths with 7 spears," Tala said. These points don't just pierce, they shatter bone. I can teach your nappers the technique. Kasumi picked up one of the points, testing its edge against his thumb. Blood welled immediately. Impossible! The stone can't be this sharp. Fire and ice, Tala said, grinning to show gaps where teeth should be. Heat the stone just so. Cool it in snowmelt. Change the crystal structure. My grandfather learned it from a dreamer who saw the technique in visions. She demonstrated over the next 3 days, transforming their understanding of stone. The process was delicate. Too much heat, and the stone became brittle. Too little, and it wouldn't take the fine edge. But when done right, the results were devastating. See how the flute channel creates flex, she showed young Hanovi, who had quick hands and a quicker mind. When it hits bone, the point doesn't just break, it explodes forward, driving fragments deep. One spear becomes many. Ayana watched with growing unease. We're making better ways to kill when there's almost nothing left to kill. Exactly, Tala agreed cheerfully. Humans always perfect the sword right before the war ends. It's our gift. She taught them more than technique. As her hands worked, she told stories from across the dying world of the mammoth hunters. The Folsom people were already adapting, making smaller points for bison. The desert walkers had given up on megafauna entirely, turning to rabbits and seeds. But you, she pointed at Dakota with a half-finished point, you're still chasing giants. Why? Dakota considered. Around the fire, his people worked on their own points, learning Tala's techniques with varying success. The sound of napping, strike, pressure, flake created a rhythm like a heartbeat. Because we are who we are, he said finally. Mammoth hunters hunt mammoths. When the last one falls, we'll become something else, but not yet. The Anzac boy would have understood, Tala said softly. You heard about him, buried over by the Shields River, not 2 winters old. They covered him in red ochre and laid 100 perfect points around him. Points he'd never use for hunts that would never come. Waste, someone muttered. Hope, Tala corrected. They buried him with tools for the next world, believing there would always be mammoths to hunt. Even as the herds vanished, they couldn't imagine a world without them. She pulled out her masterwork, a point as long as her hand, fluted on both sides, made from stone that shifted from black to deep purple in the firelight. This one I call Endbringer. It killed 3 mammoths, each one the last in its region. You follow the ending, Dakota observed. I shepherd it, she corrected. Someone must witness, someone must remember the techniques when they're no longer needed. That's why I teach everyone, so the knowledge outlives its purpose. That night she told them about the coming change, how the climate was warming, ice melting, grasslands giving way to forests where mammoths couldn't browse, how the great beasts were gathering in smaller and smaller groups on islands of habitat in a rising sea of change. There's one more gathering coming, she said, north, where the ice meets the grass. Maybe 100 mammoths, the last of the last. Every band with stones and spine will be there. When? Dakota asked, though he dreaded the answer. Next moon, when the ice rivers run red and melt. She rewrapped her points, preparing to leave with dawn. Bring your best spears, bring your worst fears, bring your children to witness. It will be a killing like the world has never seen and will never see again. She left them with more than improved weapons. She left them with the terrible certainty that they were crafting tools for an apocalypse. Each point they napped was a countdown to 0. Each improvement in technique brought the end closer, but they kept napping anyway because that's what humans do. We perfect our tools right up to the moment they become memories. The wolves found them on the 4th day of their journey north, not the ordinary wolves that shadowed hunting bands for scraps. These were the giants, the dire wolves that stood tall as a man's waist and carried night in their yellow eyes. Dakota's band had made camp in a grove of cottonwoods, the last trees they'd see before the open steppe. The children spotted them first, dark shapes moving between the trunks, too large to be shadows, too quiet to be wind. "Nobody moves," Dakota breathed. Dire wolves rarely attacked humans directly, but a pack this size, he counted at least 12, could change their minds quickly. The pack leader emerged into firelight, a female, scarred from battles Dakota couldn't imagine, with a grey muzzle that spoke of many winters survived. She didn't snarl or threaten, she simply sat, waiting. "She wants something," Kimmy whispered. The former bone stacker had proved valuable, her knowledge of animal behavior deeper than most. The wolf's eyes fixed on their travois, laden with mammoth meat from Colby. Saliva dripped from her jaws, but still she waited. Behind her, the pack whined with hunger. "They're starving," Ayana observed. "Look at their ribs." It was true. These magnificent predators, built to bring down giant ground sloths and young mammoths, were wasting away. The emptying of the world affected every hunter, not just humankind. Dakota made a decision that would have seemed madness months ago. He stood slowly, no sudden movements, and walked to the travois. The wolf tracked him but didn't rise. He cut loose a haunch of mammoth 40 lebs of meat and dragged it to the middle ground between fire and forest. "We share," he said to the wolf, though whether she understood words or just intent, he couldn't say, hunter to hunter. The pack leader approached the meat, sniffed it, then did something that made everyone gasp. She didn't take it. Instead, she tilted her head back and howled, a sound that turned blood to ice water. The pack responded, their voices weaving into a harmony that spoke of loss and ending. They were singing for the mammoth, a funeral song from one predator to honor prey that would soon exist only in memory. When the dirge ended, she took the meat gently, almost reverently, and dragged it back to her pack. They fed in silence, and Dakota's band watched, understanding that they witnessed something sacred. "My grandfather spoke of this," old Kasumi said softly. "The pact of hunters. When prey grows scarce, predators recognize each other as kin. We all serve the same master, hunger." The wolves finished their meal and melted back into darkness, all except the leader. She approached closer than any dire wolf should, close enough that Dakota could see scars crisscrossing her muzzle and could smell the wild scent of her. From her mouth, she dropped something at his feet, a Clovis point, its base still wrapped in rotted sinew, old, maybe older than any he'd seen. "She's returning it," Kimmy breathed. "Some hunter fed her pack before. She remembers." The wolf looked at Dakota with eyes that held too much intelligence, too much sorrow. That night, they heard the wolves singing in the distance, not hunting calls, those they knew well. This was different. Mournful, like they were practicing for a world without howling. "They know what we know," Ayana said, pressed close to Dakota for warmth. "The world is ending." "No," he corrected, listening to the ancient song. "Just changing. The wolves will adapt, find new prey, and survive. They've been here longer than us. They'll be here when we're gone." "And the mammoths?" He didn't answer, couldn't, because some truths were too heavy for words. In the morning, they found wolf tracks circling their camp, protection or surveillance, they couldn't say. But when they broke camp and continued north, shadows paced them through the scattered trees. The dire wolves followed, maintaining perfect distance, close enough to watch, far enough to show respect. Two species of hunters moving toward the same destination, the last great gathering, the final hunt. When the trees finally ended and the steppe opened before them like a frozen ocean, the wolves sat on a ridge and howled farewell. Dakota raised his spear in salute, hunter to hunter, killer to killer. They would not meet again. Within a generation, the dire wolves would follow the mammoths into memory. But for this moment, they were allies in the apocalypse, united by the emptiness spreading across the world. The pact held until the end. The killing ground revealed itself like a vision from the time before, a valley cupped between low hills with a spring-fed lake at its heart that hadn't frozen despite the altitude. And surrounding that water, defying belief, defying reality, mammoths. Dakota stopped breathing. Behind him, his entire band stood frozen, overwhelmed by the impossible sight. Not dozens, hundreds more mammoths than existed in all the stories, all the memories, all the dreams of their combined peoples. The ghosts walk, Kasumi whispered. We see the dead. But these were no spirits. The wind carried their scent, musky, wild, undeniably alive. Bulls with tusks like tree trunks, matriarchs with eyes that had seen the world born, calves that would never grow old. And they weren't alone. The hills crawled with humans. Every band that still carried Clovis points had come. Dakota recognized some. Ka's Sunrise Band on the eastern ridge. The desert walkers spread along the south, but most were strangers, peoples from beyond the edge of the world, drawn by the same impossible news. 500 hunters, Nakai counted. Maybe more. Not enough, Dakota said. He understood now why so many mammoths had gathered. This wasn't a herd. It was every mammoth left alive, drawn together by instincts older than memory. When extinction knocked, giants answered by standing together. A figure detached from the crowd, climbing toward their position. Tala, the napper, grinning like death itself. Beautiful, isn't it? She called. The last act of the greatest story ever told. This is madness, Dakota said. That many mammoths in defensive formation, they'll slaughter us. Yes, she agreed cheerfully, but what else are we going to do? Go home, tell our grandchildren we saw the last mammoths on Earth and walked away? She was right. Horrible, but right. Every human here knew they witnessed the end of an age. To leave now would be to forever wonder, forever regret. They were trapped by the weight of history itself. The bands are organizing, Tala continued. Tomorrow at dawn, we strike together. Every spear, every point, every prayer. Most of us will die, but the mammoths, she trailed off, looking at the valley with something almost like love. The mammoths will die with us. A fair trade. There has to be another way, Ayana said. She clutched her newest child, barely walking, with desperate strength. There is, Tala said. Walk away. Let them live. In a generation, maybe two, the changing world will kill them anyway. Forests will swallow their grasslands. Their food will vanish. They'll starve slowly, wondering why the world betrayed them. She spat. This is cleaner, honorable, hunter and prey ending together. That night, no one slept. The various bands didn't mingle, too much danger of conflict with stakes this high, but they all prepared the same way. Weapons sharpened for the last time, paint applied to faces and spears, children held close and told to remember, always remember. Dakota found himself standing at the edge of camp, watching the mammoths in the valley. They knew. How could they not? But they didn't flee. Couldn't flee. Where would they go? This was the last water, the last grass, the last place on earth that remembered what they needed. I'm frightened, a small voice said. Honovi, the boy who'd learned napping from Tala, stood beside him, clutching a spear too large for his frame. Good, Dakota said. Fear keeps you alive, but tomorrow fear won't matter. Tomorrow we will write about the end of the world. The boy considered this. Will anyone remember? Dakota thought of Murray Springs, where their footprints would fossilize beneath black algae of Blackwater Draw, where the earth would never forget the blood of all the kill sites across the continent, where stone and bone would testify to this moment. The earth will remember, he said, long after we're dust. The stones will carry our story. Every point we've napped, every bone we've stacked, every track we've left. We can't be forgotten because we're writing our names in extinction. A mammoth trumpeted in the valley, not alarm, just acknowledgement of another night survived. Tomorrow, that voice will be silent forever. Tomorrow, 500 humans would teach the world what an apex predator really meant. But tonight, hunter and hunted shared the same darkness, the same stars, the same crushing weight of knowing the dawn would break on the last day of the old world. The storm was gathering, and everyone, man and mammoth alike, was ready for the rain of blood. The sky bled pink over the valley of the ending. Dakota stood with 500 hunters, watching the sun rise on a day that would never come again. Below them, the mammoths stood like monuments to a dying age, still, silent, waiting. No one gave a signal. No one needed to. When the first spear flew, it was as if the earth itself had decided the moment had come. The hunters moved like water breaking through a dam, 500 streams of death flowing down the hillsides, converging on the valley floor. Their war cries mixed with mammoth trumpets in a sound that would echo through 13,000 years. Dakota ran with his band, spear balanced, Clovis point catching the morning light. His grandfather's words echoed, "Strike here," and the point slides between bones. But there was no precision in this chaos, no careful hunting. This was slaughter dressed in necessity. The first mammoth to fall was a young bull, bristling with 30 spears like a grotesque pincushion. He went down trumpeting defiance, his blood turning the spring water red. The matriarchs closed ranks, forming living walls around their calves, but walls of flesh couldn't stop the stone rain. Kaa's sunrise band had brought something new: fire. Bundles of grass soaked in pine pitch hurled among the herd, not to burn the mammoths, but to break their formation. Even giants feared flame, and as smoke filled the valley, their defensive circle fractured. "The calves!" someone screamed. "Don't let them escape!" Because everyone understood, leave even one breeding pair, and this apocalypse meant nothing. The extinction had to be complete, or their children would face this same terrible choice. Dakota found himself beside a mammoth cow, her eyes wide with terror and rage. She swung her tusks in great arcs, and he watched Chazar from the desert walkers disappear under her feet, his scream cut short by weight beyond imagination. He drove his spear up, feeling it slide between ribs, exactly as his grandfather had taught. The point shattered inside her, Tala's explosive design working perfectly. The cow stumbled, blood frothing from her trunk, but didn't fall. It took 6 more spears before she finally collapsed, and by then, Dakota had stopped counting the dead on both sides. The dire wolves appeared on the ridges, drawn by the copper scent of blood. They didn't attack, even they wouldn't enter this maelstrom, they simply watched, waiting for the feast that would follow. A mammoth calf, no bigger than a modern cow, broke free from the killing ground. Without thinking, Dakota gave chase. The calf ran with desperate speed, but terror made it clumsy. He caught it near a stand of deadfall, and for a moment, hunted and hunted locked eyes. It was so young, so perfect. Its trunk reached toward him, not understanding that he was death incarnate. In its eyes, he saw every mammoth that would never be born, every trumpet that would never sound, every story that would end unfinished. He drove the spear home with tears streaming down his face. The last mammoth standing was the ancient matriarch, the one who'd lived long enough to see her world empty. She stood in the ruins of her kind, sides heaving, blood seeping from 20 wounds. Around her, hunters gathered, spears ready. But she didn't charge, didn't trumpet, simply stood there looking at them with eyes that held too much to be an animal. Then, with dignity that would haunt every witness forever, she lay down carefully, deliberately. She positioned herself among her fallen family and closed those ancient eyes. No one threw the final spear. They didn't need to. She died as she chose, on her own terms, taking the memory of mammoths with her into whatever darkness waits for giants. The valley fell silent, except for the cries of the dying and the wind through grass that would never again know mammoth footsteps. The last day had dawned, and now it was ending. The killing was over. The real work had just begun. 412 mammoths lay dead in the valley. 93 humans lay with them. The survivors stood among the carnage like sleepwalkers, unable to process what they'd done. "Start cutting," Tala commanded, her voice cracking through the shock. "The meat won't preserve itself." But this was beyond any butchering they'd known. There weren't enough hands, enough tools, enough time. The sun climbed toward its zenith, and already the bodies were beginning to bloat. Flies descended in biblical clouds. Dakota organized his band with numb efficiency. The same divisions they'd used at Murray Springs, but multiplied beyond reason. Ayana led the hide removal, though there was no way to properly cure so many. Children were set to gathering stones for cache pits, though the earth couldn't hold this much death. "We're going to lose most of it," Nakai said, stating the obvious. His arms were red to the shoulders and the day was still young. It was true. They could work for a moon and not process a tenth of what lay before them. The waste was obscene, a mockery of every lesson about honoring the animal's sacrifice. But what choice did they have? Leave the bodies to rot where they fell? The bands worked in grim cooperation. Old rivalries meant nothing when drowning in mammoth blood. The desert walkers had brought salt, precious and rare, and shared it freely. Kay's Sunrise Band knew songs that made the repetitive cutting bearable. Everyone contributed what they could to the impossible task. By midday, the dire wolves could wait no longer. They descended from the ridges, and the humans were too exhausted to drive them off. An uneasy truce developed, humans working one side of a carcass while wolves fed on the other. The Feast of Ashes had begun. "Look!" Kimmy pointed with a bloody knife. Condors circled overhead, their wings blotting out sections of sky. Ravens carpeted the ground like a living shadow. Every scavenger for 100 miles was coming to the feast. Old Kasumi sat on a mammoth skull, no longer able to stand. "This is how the world ends," he said to anyone listening. "Not with hunting, but with waste. We've killed more than we can honor." Young Honovi worked beside Dakota, learning the harsh lesson of excess. "Why did we kill them all?" the boy asked. "Why not just what we needed?" Dakota paused in his cutting. How to explain the momentum of extinction, the terrible logic that said leaving any alive meant doing this again? The fear that if they didn't end it completely, their children would face the same awful choice. "Because we're human," he said finally. "We don't know how to stop." As the sun began its descent, they abandoned all pretense of preservation. The meat mountain had defeated them. They took what they could carry, barely a fraction, and left the rest to the gathering host of scavengers. The various bands began to separate, laden with as much as they could transport. There were no farewells, no promises to meet again. What was there to say? They'd gathered to end an age, and they'd succeeded beyond their worst nightmares. Dakota's band made camp upwind of the valley, but the smell followed them. It would follow them forever, the stench of ending, of excess, of a feast that fed everything except honor. That night they could hear the scavengers at work. Wolves sang between mouthfuls. Condors squabbled over choice pieces. The very earth seemed to groan under the weight of so much death. "We won," Ayana said. But it wasn't a celebration, it was a diagnosis. "Did we?" Dakota asked. He thought of the mammoth cow's eyes, the calf's reaching trunk, the matriarch's dignified surrender. Or did we just lose something we'll spend the rest of time trying to remember? No one answered. In the distance, the Feast of Ashes continued. 412 mammoths were being reduced to bone and memory. By spring, only scattered skeletons would remain. By summer, even those would be scattered. But the story would persist. In the stones stained with blood, in the earth that remembered the weight of giants, in the dreams of every child born, after who would hear the word mammoth and feel an emptiness they couldn't name. The Feast of Ashes burned through the night, and with it, An entire world turned to smoke. Spring came, but the mammoths didn't. Dakota stood at Murray Springs, where it all began for him, watching the cottonwoods bud with leaves the giants would never browse. The ancient trails were already blurring, grass growing where 10,000 years of footsteps had worn the earth to stone. His band had survived the winter on mammoth meat, but it sat heavy in their bellies. Every meal tasted like an ending. The children played with ivory toys, carved from tusks that would never grow again, and their laughter sounded hollow in the empty world. The hunters from the eastern band sent word, Ayana said, approaching with their youngest on her hip. No mammoths anywhere, not one. He nodded. They'd known it would be so, but confirmation still struck like a spear to the gut. From the forests of the east to the western sea, from the ice in the north to the deserts of the south, the continent was empty of giants. What do we hunt now? Nakai asked. He'd grown thin over the winter despite the abundance of meat they all had, bodies fed but spirits starving. Whatever's left, Dakota replied. Bison, elk, deer, smaller game for smaller people. It was already happening. Word came of bands adapting, shrinking their points for smaller prey. The Folsom people had developed a new style, delicate, precise, nothing like the mammoth-killing monsters they'd all carried. Evolution in stone, happening in real time. Kimmy approached from where she'd been teaching the children to nap. Her baby had survived the winter and now toddled on unsteady legs, reaching for everything with chubby fingers. A child who would never see a mammoth, never understand why the adults went quiet when they saw elephant-shaped clouds. I've been thinking, she said, about the bone stacking at Colby. We preserved meat in the bones. What if we could preserve memory the same way? How? Dakota asked, though he suspected he knew. Stories, songs, marks on stone, ways to tell the children's children what we saw, what we did. She paused. What we ended up with. Old Kasumi, who'd grown ancient over the winter, hobbled over. The young ones don't believe it already. Tell them about mammoths tall as 3 men. They think we're inventing monsters. By my grandchildren's time, mammoths will be myths. Then we make better myths, Dakota decided. True ones. We teach them the weight of tusks, the sound of trumpets, the earth shaking under mammoth feet. We teach them what we traded for this empty earth. They spent the spring developing new traditions, songs that captured the mammoth's call, dances that mimicked their swaying walk, stories that tried and failed to convey the sheer impossibility of their existence. But it wasn't enough. How could words capture the reality of a mammoth? How could gestures convey their presence? They were trying to preserve sunlight in cupped hands, and it kept leaking through their fingers. Summer brought the first mammoth dreams. Dakota would wake gasping, sure he'd heard trumpeting in the distance. Others reported the same, phantom herds moving through their sleep, always just out of reach, always accusing. The land feels wrong, Ayana said one evening, watching the sunset paint the empty plains like a body missing its heart. She was right. Without mammoths to create clearings, forests were encroaching on grasslands. Without their trampling, water sources were changing course. The very shape of the world was shifting, adapting to the absence of giants. They found a mammoth skeleton that autumn, weathered white by sun and rain. The children climbed on it like a playground, having no context for the magnificence it once supported. Dakota watched them play and felt something break inside. This was the future. Children playing on the bones of wonders they'd never understand. A world where mammoth was just a word, like dragon or thunderbird, fantasy creatures in grandfather stories. We did this, he said to the empty sky. We looked at something magnificent and saw only meat. We traded forever for a few full bellies. But even as he mourned, he knew he'd do it again. Because that's what humans did. They survived, they adapted, they consumed whatever the present offered, and left the future to sort out the consequences. The skeleton gleamed in the autumn light, a monument to appetites that knew no restraint. Soon even these bones would crumble, and the mammoths would complete their journey from flesh to memory to forgetting. The earth was empty of giants, and it always would be. 5 winters after the last mammoth fell, Dakota barely recognized the boy holding a spear beside him. Honovi had grown tall, lean, with eyes that had never seen anything larger than bison. He was a new kind of hunter for a new kind of world. "Smaller points, grandfather," Honovi said, showing off his latest creation. The Folsom point was a marvel, delicate, precise, half the size of the Clovis monsters, gathering dust in their bundles. "For a smaller game, grandfather." When did Dakota become old enough for that title? But looking at his hands, scarred from 1,000 nappings, he saw his grandfather's hands. Time was a river, and he'd crossed to the far shore without noticing. They were tracking a small bison herd, maybe 30 animals. Once, that would have been hardly worth the effort. Now, it was wealth beyond measure. The world had shrunk to fit human ambitions. "Tell me again about the mammoths," Honovi said, as they waited for the herd to settle. Dakota had told the story so many times it had worn smooth like river stones, but each telling lost something. The fear was fading. The awe was dimming. He was watching the mammoths die a second death in memory. "They were," he began, then stopped. How to explain? Imagine bison tall as trees, with tusks like bent spears and voices that shook the earth. Honovi nodded politely, the way children do when adults speak of impossible things. He believed the words, but not the truth behind them. How could he? His world had always been mammoth empty. The bison hunt was quick, efficient, and boring. 2 animals down with minimal effort. No earth-shaking charges, no desperate battles between titans, just food falling to superior technology. The new normal. As they butchered, Dakota noticed how Honovi worked. Quick, efficient, already planning the next hunt before this one ended. No reverence, no ceremony. Why would there be? Bison were plentiful. Take these 2, find more tomorrow. The arithmetic of abundance. "The old ways are fading," Ayana said that night, watching the young hunters joke around the fire. "They don't understand scarcity, don't understand that once something's gone, it's gone forever." She was working on a hide painting, trying to capture a mammoth from memory, but the proportions were wrong, the details blurring. Each attempt looked more like a strange bison than the giants they'd known. Tala visited their camp that winter, looking ancient beyond her years. She still carried her bundle of perfect Clovis points, but now they were curiosities, not tools. The young hunters examined them like artifacts from a forgotten age. "I found something," she told Dakota privately. "North, where the ice meets the tundra, mammoth tracks frozen in mud that turned to stone. Perfect preservation. Want to see?" They traveled for days to reach the site. There, captured in ancient mud, were the last steps of a mammoth family, adults, juveniles, a calf, walking north toward ice and emptiness, away from the world that had no room for them. "When were these made?" Dakota asked, though he suspected. "Just before," Tala said, "maybe days before the Great Gathering. They knew what was coming and tried to escape to where humans couldn't follow." He knelt beside the smallest tracks, running his fingers along the preserved ridges. Each footprint was perfect, down to the texture of the sole. The earth remembered even if people couldn't. "I'm staying here," Tala announced. "Going to map every track, measure every stride, create a record that can't fade like memory." "Why?" Dakota asked, though he understood. "Because someone should. Because in 1,000 years, when mammoths are just myths, these stones will still tell the truth. We were here, they were here, and then we ended them." Dakota left her there, a single woman with stone tools and obsession, trying to preserve footprints of ghosts. He understood the impulse. They were all trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. Back at camp, he watched Honovi teaching even younger hunters his efficient techniques. No waste, no ceremony, no connection to the impossibility they'd inherited. They were better hunters in every measurable way, faster, cleaner, more practical. They just weren't mammoth hunters. That was a title that died with the giants, leaving only old men with fading scars and stories no one quite believed. The new hunters owned the earth, small game for small ambitions, in a world made small by absence. Evolution in reverse, perfecting the ordinary, because the extraordinary was extinct. The archaeologist's hands trembled as she brushed away 13,000 years of dust. Dr. Sarah Chen had been excavating at Murray Springs for 3 seasons, but nothing had prepared her for this. A perfect Clovis point, still hafted to its broken shaft, and beneath it, pressed into the ancient black mat, a human handprint. Someone had knelt here, hands splayed in mammoth blood, leaving a signature that time couldn't erase. "My God," whispered her assistant James. "It's like they're reaching through time." Sarah sat back on her heels, overwhelmed. She'd studied these people through their stones and bones, their kill sites and caches, but this was intimate. A hand no different from her own, pressed into earth at the moment everything changed. The excavation had revealed the full story of Murray Springs, the mammoth trackways Vance Haynes had found in the 1960s, the scattered Clovis points, the bones of giants arranged by human hands, and now this handprint, a personal mark at the end of the world. That evening in the field lab, Sarah carefully cleaned the point. The napping was exquisite, controlled, precise, deadly. Someone had put their soul into this stone, creating a tool that was equal parts weapon and art. "Imagine being there," James said, studying their site photos. "Knowing you're killing the last mammoths on Earth." Did they know? Sarah wondered. Or did they think there would always be more somewhere over the horizon? She thought of Dakota, the name she'd given the handprint's owner, a fiction. But archaeology was half science, half story. Someone had knelt in mammoth blood and pressed their hand to earth. Someone had carried the weight of ending. The point yielded its secrets under microscopic analysis. Blood residue, mammoth confirmed by protein analysis, microscopic wear patterns showing repeated use. This wasn't a hunter's first kill or last. This was the work of someone who'd perfected the art of extinction. Sarah's research had tracked the pattern across the continent. Murray Springs, Blackwater Draw, Colby, Dent. A constellation of endings, each perfectly preserved by quirks of geology. The mammoth's last stands, written in stone and bone. But it was the human story that haunted her. The isotope analysis from the Anzac child showing a diet of 40% mammoth meat, the sophisticated weapons, the continent-spanning trade networks. These weren't desperate primitives, but sophisticated people who'd made a choice. "They were like us," she told her graduate students during a site visit. "Same brains, same hearts, same capacity for beauty and horror. They just lived at a hinge point in history." She showed them the handprint, preserved under clear stabilizer. This person watched the world change, participated in it, then marked the moment, maybe knowing someone would find it, maybe just needing to say, "I was here." The students were quiet, feeling the weight of time. One finally asked, "Do you think they felt guilty?" Sarah considered. The archaeological record showed rapid adaptation after the extinctions, new point styles for smaller game, dietary shifts, cultural changes, either guilt or simple pragmatism. The record couldn't say. "I think they felt what we feel," she said finally, "that mixture of triumph and loss that comes with being human. They won their world by emptying it, just like we're winning ours." That night, alone at the site, Sarah returned to the handprint. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars Dakota would have seen. Somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called, descendants of scavengers who'd fed on mammoth remains. She pressed her own hand next to the print, not quite touching. 13,000 years collapsed to nothing. Hunter and archaeologist connected by curiosity and consequence. "I found you," she whispered. "Your stones, your bones, your moment. We remember." The wind through the cottonwoods might have been an answer, or just wind. But Sarah chose to believe that somewhere in whatever darkness waits for hunters, Dakota knew his mark had held. The mammoths were gone forever, but the hand that ended them reached through time, reminding each generation that we are capable of anything, even the unforgivable, even the unforgettable. The last mammoth hunt was over, but its echoes would resonate until the last human hand pressed against earth, leaving its own mark for someone else to find and wonder.